On October 20th, 1986, a passenger jet slammed into the ground at over 400 miles per hour, killing everyone on board. The black box revealed something that made investigators' blood run cold. The pilots weren't fighting a mechanical failure. They weren't battling bad weather. They were settling a bet, a stupid, arrogant bet about who was the better pilot. And 70 people paid the price. This is the story of Aeroflot Flight 6502. The day cockpit machismo turned a routine flight into a death sentence. The Soviet Union in 1986 wasn't exactly the pinnacle of safety culture. This was a country where Chernobyl had just melted down 6 months earlier, where corners were cut, where rules were more like suggestions, and where admitting mistakes could get you disappeared. Aeroflot, the state airline, embodied all of this perfectly. It was the largest airline in the world, operating more aircraft than any other carrier on the planet. But size doesn't equal safety, not even close. To put it mildly, terrifying. Between 1946 and 1989, the airline recorded over 8,200 deaths. That's not a typo. 8,200 people. To put that in perspective, that's more fatalities than every other major airline in the world combined during the same period. The joke in the West was that Aeroflot stood for Aeroflop. Soviet officials weren't laughing. They couldn't. The statistics were classified. The crashes were covered up. The pilots were undertrained, overworked, and operating in a culture where authority was never questioned and mistakes were always punished. This culture created a special breed of Soviet pilot, confident to the point of delusion. Skilled, sure, but often more concerned with proving their prowess than actually flying safely. And on October 20th, 1986, two of these pilots were about to demonstrate exactly why that attitude was lethal. Flight 6502 was a domestic route. Nothing exotic, nothing challenging. Just a standard hop from Sverdlovsk, now called Yekaterinburg, to Grozny in the North Caucasus. About 1,400 miles. A little over 2 hours in the air. The aircraft was a Tupolev Tu-134A, a Soviet-made twin-engine jet that was the workhorse of Aeroflot's domestic fleet. Reliable enough when maintained properly and flown correctly. At the controls was Captain Alexander Kluyev. Thousands of flight hours. A man who knew the Tu-134 inside and out. But experience doesn't equal judgment. And Kluyev was about to demonstrate catastrophically poor judgment. His co-pilot was First Officer Gennady Zhernov, eager to prove himself. The kind of guy who probably looked up to his captain. The kind of guy who wouldn't question authority even when that authority was about to kill him. The flight took off from Sverdlovsk's Koltsovo airport at 8:16 p.m. local time. 70 passengers settled into their seats. Most were heading home. Some were traveling for work. A few were visiting family. None of them had any idea that their pilots were having a conversation that would seal their fate. Here's where things get weird. And by weird, I mean horrifyingly reckless. Captain Kluyev, the experienced pilot, the guy responsible for 70 lives, turned to his co-pilot and made a bet. He bet that he could land the plane using only instruments. No visual references. No looking out the window. Just the gauges and the instruments. Why? Because he wanted to prove he was a better pilot than Zhernov. That's it. No emergency. No training exercise. Just pure ego. Now, landing on instruments alone isn't inherently dangerous. It's called an instrument approach. And pilots train for it constantly. It's what you do when visibility is terrible, when fog blankets the runway, when you literally cannot see where you're going. But here's the thing. The weather that night was perfect. He wanted to land the plane blind. Literally blind. He may have even covered the windows with additional materials. The investigation couldn't confirm exactly how he achieved total darkness. But the result was clear. The pilots couldn't see anything outside the aircraft. Think about that for a second. You're flying a commercial jet with 70 people on board, and you voluntarily blind yourself, for a bet, because you want to prove you're hot stuff. The weather was perfect. Everything was going according to plan, except for one tiny detail. Captain Kluyev had sealed himself inside a metal tube traveling at hundreds of miles per hour, with no ability to see where he was going. Altimeters to show altitude. Artificial horizons to show the aircraft's orientation. Navigation equipment to show their position relative to the runway. In theory, If you're skilled enough, and the instruments are accurate enough, you can land a plane using nothing but these gauges. Pilots do it all the time in bad weather, but there's a reason it's called an instrument approach and not an instrument landing. At some point, you're supposed to look up. You're supposed to verify that what the instruments are telling you matches reality. You're supposed to make sure you're not about to plow into the ground. Kuluyev didn't look up. The Tu-134 began its descent toward Grozny Airport. Everything appeared normal to air traffic control. The aircraft was on the correct approach path. The speed was appropriate. The altitude was decreasing as expected. Inside the cockpit, Kuluyev was focused entirely on his instruments. First Officer Zhernov was probably nervous but unwilling to challenge his captain. This was the Soviet Union. You didn't question authority. Ever. Even when that authority was clearly making a catastrophic mistake. But something was wrong. The aircraft was descending too quickly. The instruments were giving Kuluyev information, but he was either misreading them or ignoring warning signs. The altimeter showed they were getting lower. The vertical speed indicator showed they were descending rapidly. But without visual references, without seeing the ground approaching, the human brain struggles to process these abstract numbers as real. Imminent danger. At 10:16 p.m., exactly 2 hours after takeoff, Flight 6502 was on final approach. The runway was less than 3 miles away. The aircraft should have been at around 1,500 feet, preparing for a gentle glide down to the tarmac. Instead, it was significantly lower, way too low. The ground proximity warning system, a system designed to alert pilots when they're too close to the ground, should have been screaming. But here's the thing about Soviet aircraft maintenance. Sometimes systems didn't work. Sometimes they were disabled. Sometimes they were just ignored. The investigation would later reveal issues with the aircraft's systems. But by that point, it didn't matter. The plane was already descending toward disaster. Inside the cockpit, First Officer Zhernov might have noticed something was wrong. He might have seen the altimeter readings and realized they were too low. He might have wanted to say something. But in the rigid hierarchy of Soviet aviation, co-pilots didn't question captains. They followed orders. They kept quiet. And sometimes they died because of it. The Tu-134 continued its descent. Outside, in the perfect visibility that made this entire stunt completely unnecessary, the ground was rushing up to meet them. Trees, fields, the airport perimeter, all invisible to the pilots sealed inside their self-imposed blindness. At 10:17 p.m., 1 minute after beginning final approach, the aircraft's landing gear touched something. Not the runway, the ground. Specifically, they hit the ground about 600 meters short of the runway. That's about 2,000 feet. More than a third of a mile before the start of the landing strip. The aircraft was supposed to be in the air. It slammed into the earth. But they didn't stop there. Oh no, because Captain Kuluyev still thought he was on approach, still thought he was in control, still believed his instruments were telling him everything he needed to know. The aircraft bounced. The landing gear, not designed for off-runway impacts, absorbed some of the shock. The plane became airborne again. Briefly, horrifyingly. For a split second, Kuluyev might have thought he'd saved it, that this was just a hard landing, that he'd pull off his little stunt after all. He didn't. The Tu-134 came down again. Harder this time. The landing gear collapsed. The fuselage hit the ground and began to break apart. Metal screamed. Fuel tanks ruptured. And in the terrible physics of an aircraft impact, the plane began to disintegrate. The right wing separated. The fuselage broke into multiple pieces. Fuel sprayed everywhere, mixing with electrical sparks, hot metal, and the friction of wreckage scraping across the ground. Fire erupted instantly. The kind of fire that consumes everything. The kind of fire that doesn't leave survivors. The impact site was a scene from hell. Burning wreckage scattered across a field. Bodies everywhere. Twisted metal. The acrid smell of burning jet fuel mixing with the horrible reality of what happens when 70 people die in fire and twisted metal. Emergency crews arrived. But there was nothing to rescue. No survivors stumbling from the wreckage. No miracle saves. Just death. Complete, total, pointless death. All 63 passengers were killed instantly, or died in the fire. All 7 crew members were dead. Captain Alexander Kuluyev, the man who made the bet, died in the wreckage he created. First Officer Gennady Zhernov, who probably knew this was a bad idea, but couldn't say anything, died beside him. The flight attendants, who had nothing to do with any of this, who were just doing their jobs, died in the cabin. The passengers, who trusted these pilots with their lives, who had no idea what was happening in the cockpit, burned to death or were crushed in the impact. 70 people, gone, in seconds. Because of a bet, the Soviet government initially tried to downplay the crash. That was standard procedure. Aviation disasters were embarrassing. They suggested weakness. They contradicted the narrative of Soviet superiority and competence. But this crash was too big to hide. Too many victims. Too many families demanding answers. Soviet officials descended on the crash site. The flight data recorder, the Soviet version of a black box, was recovered from the wreckage. And when investigators listened to the cockpit voice recorder, when they heard the conversations between Kluyev and Zhernov, when they understood what had happened, the silence must have been deafening. The black box revealed everything. The casual conversation about the bet. The decision to blind themselves. The approach that went wrong. The lack of any emergency. The complete absence of mechanical failure. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a freak accident. This wasn't even incompetence. Really. This was deliberate recklessness. This was ego. This was two pilots playing games with other people's lives. The Soviet Aviation Authority, in an uncharacteristic moment of transparency, probably forced by the sheer audacity of what happened, released some details of the investigation. They admitted pilot error. They admitted the bet. They even admitted that Captain Kluyev had intentionally blocked visual references. In the Soviet Union of 1986, this level of admission was almost unprecedented. But here's where it gets even worse. Because Flight 6502 wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom. A symptom of a culture that valued bravado over safety. That punished admission of weakness. That created an environment where pilots felt compelled to prove themselves through increasingly reckless stunts. Soviet pilots called these demonstrations pokazuka. It's a Russian word that roughly translates to showing off or putting on a show. It was endemic in Soviet aviation. Pilots would perform unnecessary aerobatic maneuvers. They'd fly lower than authorized. They'd push their aircraft to the limits just to impress observers or prove their skills. Sometimes they got away with it. Sometimes they didn't. People died. The investigation also revealed another damning detail. This wasn't Captain Khrushchev's first time pulling a stunt like this. He had apparently performed similar blind landings before. He'd gotten away with it. He'd probably been praised for his skill. He'd built a reputation as a hotshot pilot. And that reputation had fed his ego until it became lethal. Think about the last moments inside that aircraft. The passengers probably had no idea anything was wrong until the very end. The approach would have felt normal. Maybe a little turbulent. Then the impact. The terror. The fire. The desperate final seconds. And in the cockpit, the horrible realization that the bet had been lost. That the instruments weren't enough. That reality doesn't care about your ego. First Officer Zhernov probably knew they were too low. The altimeter was right there. The rate of descent was visible. But he didn't speak up. He couldn't. In the Soviet aviation culture, questioning a captain could end your career. So he stayed quiet and died because of it. His last thoughts were probably regret. Probably the desperate wish that he'd said something. Anything. It was too late. The aftermath of Flight 6502 did lead to some changes in Soviet aviation. Training programs were revised. There was more emphasis on crew resource management. The idea that co-pilots should speak up when they see something wrong. Penalties for unauthorized maneuvers were increased. But culture doesn't change overnight. The pokazuka mentality persisted for years. Aeroflot's safety record didn't significantly improve until after the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the airline restructured, when Western safety standards were adopted, when the culture of secrecy and punishment began to erode, today, Aeroflot is actually a relatively safe airline. But that transformation took decades, and it was built on the graves of thousands of people who died in preventable accidents. Flight 6502 stands out even in Aeroflot's horrible history because of how unnecessary it was. Most aviation disasters involve some combination of mechanical failure, bad weather, and human error. This one was just human error. Distilled, arrogant human error. There was no excuse, no mitigating factors. Just a captain who thought he was better than physics and a co-pilot who couldn't stop him. The families of the victims received minimal compensation. This was the Soviet Union. Life was cheap. Death was common. The government provided some support, but nothing that came close to acknowledging the magnitude of the loss. No lawsuits. No public outcry that led to meaningful change. Just quiet funerals and buried grief. Today, the crash of Flight 6502 is studied in aviation safety courses around the world. It's a textbook case of everything that can go wrong when ego overrides judgment. When showing off matters more than safety. When hierarchy prevents critical communication. It's a reminder that flying is serious. That passengers trust pilots with their lives. And that trust should never, ever be betrayed. The crash site near Grozny doesn't have a monument. There's no memorial listing the names of the 70 dead. The field where they died has long since been cleared. Nature has reclaimed the ground. But the memory persists. Flight 6502 is infamous. A cautionary tale. A reminder that the worst accidents don't happen because of bad luck. They happen because someone made a choice. A stupid, arrogant, lethal choice. Captain Alexander Kuluev wanted to prove he was a great pilot. Instead, he proved that skill without judgment is worthless. That confidence without humility is dangerous. And that a simple, stupid bet between two men trying to show off, can kill 70 innocent people in seconds. The cockpit voice recorder from Flight 6502 still exists somewhere in Russian aviation archives. It's been analyzed countless times, studied by investigators, used in training, cited in papers about aviation psychology. And every time someone listens to those final minutes, they hear the same thing. Two pilots so focused on their competition that they forgot their responsibility, so obsessed with proving themselves that they ignored reality. At the end, the sound of impact, the sound of fire, the sound of 70 people dying because someone made a bet. That's the legacy of Aeroflot Flight 6502. Not just a crash. Not just a tragedy, but a monument to human arrogance. A reminder that in aviation there are no winners when you gamble with other people's lives. Only victims.